Hello, friends. This evening, let's step into the world of medieval villagers. The everyday people whose courage and cleverness saw them through some of the harshest, frostiest nights in history. Through simple, homegrown tricks and shared sleeping habits, their tale is one of perseverance and resourcefulness. Before you settle in, I'd be grateful if you'd like this video and subscribe, but only if you truly appreciate what I share. And please, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what the local time is. It's always a joy to discover just how far our circle reaches. Now go ahead and dim the lights, maybe switch on a fan for a gentle background hum, and let's gently begin tonight's exploration together. When most people picture the Middle Ages, images of tournaments, feasts, and lively festivals might come to mind. For common folk, though, winter was less about celebration and more about the urgent question: how do we stay alive tonight? It wasn't simply a time of year, it was a yearly ordeal, a stern visitor that left little room for mistakes. Imagine waking up in a small hut shaped from mud and twigs. The walls are so thin, you could hear a bird cough outside. There's no real insulation, almost no proper windows. Maybe just a small opening plugged with animal hide. And as for arguing over a thermostat, well, that wasn't an option. The inside of the home was usually only barely warmer than the outdoors. If it was freezing outside, inside was just a little less so, just enough for congratulations. The nights were hardest. Darkness covered everything. Winds screamed through every gap, and the hearth's fire flickered weakly, warming only the feet of those sitting right by it. If you weren't close, you might as well have been camping outside, only with less to snack on. Their clothing didn't offer much more help. Villagers didn't have plush furs or down-filled blankets. At best, you owned a few rough woolen tunics, maybe a cloak with a lingering smell of goat, and the hope that piling these on would keep you warm, though, to be honest, it rarely did. As for soft bedding, forget it. Sleeping spaces were usually little more than sacks packed with hay or straw, sometimes with a sprinkling of rushes, and plenty of fleas for company. Luxury had a different meaning back then. Cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was life-threatening. Frostbite, hypothermia, and the real danger of freezing in your sleep were always a concern, especially for children and elders. Each morning you woke up with breath in your body was a quiet victory, worth a little celebration, perhaps with a slightly less icy breakfast route. So making it through a medieval winter was never about comfort. It meant putting on every layer you owned, huddling with animals, and hoping your eyebrows didn't freeze overnight. And with each day, a new challenge awaited. If you think your apartment is cold when the window doesn't close right, medieval villagers would have a thing or two to say. Their homes weren't drafty, they were more like wind tunnels with a roof. Most houses were built in what historians call wattle and daub, meaning wooden sticks woven together, then plastered with a mixture of mud, straw, and, yes, animal droppings. They didn't use dung to be unpleasant. It was simply effective and always on hand. Yet, no matter how carefully it was applied, those walls were no match for the season's fiercest storms. The wind could find its way through every split and chink, swirling around inside and never letting you really settle in. Privacy was non-existent. Real warmth was rare. But you certainly developed character. Roofs, too, could be a problem. Thatched roofs looked charming, but all too quickly they sagged, dripped, and let in all sorts of creatures. There was nothing quite like a squirrel unexpectedly landing on the supper table. Window openings, where they existed at all, were tiny and covered with hide or wooden shutters. Even the local lord likely only had a single tiny piece of glass. Ordinary folk just hoped their coverings stayed put in a storm. Floors weren't much better, usually just packed dirt. Heavy rain or melting snow meant mud would slowly ooze up from the ground, so there was a sort of indoor swamp, though no one thanked Mother Nature for it. In winter, every step inside your home could feel like wading across a chilly bog. The cold struck from every direction, above, below, and from the walls themselves. You were surrounded. But these villagers were not the type to give up. They filled cracks with moss and fabric scraps, blocked the biggest drafts with anything they could find, and squeezed together for warmth, the best kind of do-it-yourself insulation. Sheep fat was even rubbed into the walls on occasion. Often, this creativity and stubbornness kept them from becoming frozen statues in their own homes. When the house barely held together and your best defense was a patchwork of mud and animal hair, finding a reason to laugh was itself a sign of courage, if your teeth would stop chattering long enough. Alongside the biting air, villagers also faced a secret enemy, cold rising from the ground. Floors were not really floors, just a patch of earth, maybe with some straw or rushes layered on top for the illusion of coziness. But you were still lying right above cold, hard dirt. This chill crept into your bones. Anything dropped on the floor overnight became an icy relic by morning. To keep it at bay, people tried covering their floors with thick layers of straw or rushes, sometimes borrowed from a neighbor's field. This helped, but the straw quickly flattened and became damp, offering little true comfort, just a crunchy soundscape to match the misery. And then there were the beds, simple wooden frames, if you had one, stuffed with even more straw or hay. These piles were prickly, always shifting beneath you, and didn't do much against the cold. Getting through the night was a dance of twisting and turning, trying to keep your blood flowing and your skin unfrozen. A full night's rest wasn't about fanciful dreams, but about waking up with all your fingers and toes. Through all of this, the real champion of the winter night was the fire, the hearth at the heart of every home. This wasn't a fancy fireplace with carved stone or a neat chimney. Instead, it was usually just a fire pit or a ring of stones, a handful of half-burned logs, and enough smoke to make you wonder if you were turning into smoked meat yourself. Most homes didn't have chimneys. Smoke filtered out through cracks, a hole in the roof, or drifted straight into your lungs. Not good for breathing, but at least it often chased out the fleas and other pests, the medieval answer to fumigation. The hearth was more than just a heat source. It was a kitchen, a lantern, and the family's gathering spot. People cooked, told stories, sang, or simply stared into the glowing logs, especially since there wasn't much to do after sunset. Keeping the fire alive wasn't just a chore. It was vital. Letting it go out overnight was as dangerous as leaving the door open to the freezing wind. And lighting it again was no easy task. You needed flint, steel, good tinder, and a little luck. Everyone chipped in, adding peat, sticks, or, on lucky days, a dry log. The battle between human determination and the cold's constant push never ended. This little fire might splutter and smoke, but it was hope made visible. Running out of ale was a small worry compared to losing the fire for one night. If the fire died, the bone-chilling air filled every corner faster than you could shout for help. And since matches and lighters didn't exist, restarting a fire was demanding. Strike flint and steel, pray, and gently nurse a tiny spark while your hands froze. So, villagers became skilled at banking their fire, covering its glowing coals with ash right before bed. The ash insulated the embers, protecting them until morning, if you did it right. At sunrise, you could gently reawaken the coals and rebuild the fire. If you did it wrong, well, waking up was much chillier, and tempers were short. To some, banking the fire was practically the family's best-kept tradition. Each household had little tricks, using dry or damp ash, piling it in their own special way. If you had an opinion about how to do it better, you'd spark a debate as lively as any. Sometimes, no matter how carefully you banked the fire, A stray gust of wind could snuff it out, or an animal could disturb it, so families sometimes took turns getting up at night. In the end, you weren't mastering nature, just gaining a few extra hours of warmth to survive until dawn. If the morning greeted you with just one ember left alive, you'd won another round. In the medieval world, the more the merrier was less about parties and more about getting through winter. When the fire dimmed and cold crept into every corner, your best chance for warmth was each other. On the coldest nights, the objective wasn't comfort or privacy. It was simply to avoid freezing to the floor. Everyone in the house squeezed into the most sheltered spot they could find, wrapped in every bit of spare cloth, shaping a bundled mass of bodies, like a living, snoring casserole. Little ones snuggled deep between parents. Grandparents tucked themselves along the edges, and if a cousin or neighbor turned up on the doorstep, there'd somehow always be room for one more. Getting a spot in the middle was ideal, surrounded by warmth. Being on the edge was akin to sleeping by an open freezer door. Heaven help you if you tossed and turned, or accidentally pushed someone closer to the icy wall. Bedding, too, was usually shared. One straw mattress packed tight under the weight of everyone, steadily flattening through winter's nights. Hygiene wasn't a highlight, and the smells could be strong, but nobody felt fussy when the alternative was frozen feet. Body heat wasn't just welcome, it was smart. Some old advice, in fact, suggested placing the sturdiest family members on the outside as a barrier, with babies and frail elders cocooned at the center, the most cherished sources of warmth. Over time, these nightly gatherings became part of life, times for stories, songs, and whispered talks under one tattered blanket. So, the next time your pet takes your spot or your sibling steals your covers, remember, at least you're not sharing your bed with an entire barn. And on that note, village homes really did bring the barn inside. Cows, goats, pigs, chickens. If it gave off body heat, it had a place by the hearth. This wasn't an odd tradition. It was necessary. Every extra degree of warmth mattered, and the animals were less likely to be stolen if sheltered at home, too. Nights became a noisy, crowded blend of people and livestock. Pigs snuffling near the fire, cows huddled close to the walls, chickens roosting wherever they found space. The smell could be overwhelming, especially by spring, but most villagers stopped noticing. It was the scent of survival. Certain animals got the best sleeping spots. Cows, being largest and warmest, usually claimed the center, with goats close by and chickens tucked wherever they could. Pigs were content anywhere. This came with its own problems. A chicken might decide your hair was a safe perch, or you could step into something unpleasant in the dark. Still, the math was simple. Cold was deadly, and a warm cow could be the difference between life and loss. Clothing in these winters was about safety, not style. No one cared what was fashionable. The only rule was to wear everything you owned. First, a linen shirt, usually rough and not especially clean. Then, as many woolen tunics as you had, leggings that drooped at the knees, and a thick cloak. If you had a sheepskin, that was your prized layer. All dressed, you might have felt 10% warmer and a great deal itchier. Shoes were a luxury. Most wrapped their feet in rags and stuffed them into wooden clogs. If the cold pushed through anyway, you just added more cloth. Washing any of this gear was nearly impossible, dragging clothes to a frozen stream, breaking the ice, and waiting days for them to dry. So most accepted the smoke, sweat, and sheep scent as a fair trade for warmth. As it happened, all that dirt and grease did some good, sealing in heat like a thick homemade windbreaker, if not a pleasant one. Hats, scarves, and gloves were valuables. A cap could decide whether you woke up warm or with your hair frozen to the wall. Gloves crafted from scraps of leather or cloth were treasured, even if they looked odd. Children were bundled until they waddled. looking like round vegetables with hardly any movement possible. Warmth was everything. So if you ever grumble about piling on layers before heading outdoors, consider that medieval villagers wore most of their wardrobe daily, looking like walking sacks of laundry and counting themselves lucky for it. In that society, getting dirty was a wise move. Winter demanded protection against heat loss, and clean linens, surprisingly, offered little help. Dirt and oils gradually filled the cloth's tiny gaps, making it less permeable to wind. So, over time, what might look like giving up was actually a clever way to survive. The more earthy buildup, the more it blocked the chill. Washing up could even be seen as risky. Some believed it made you more prone to illness. Baths and laundry were rare. Soap was saved for very special days. Instead, people simply layered new clothes over old, creating a quiet history of everyday's struggles, each spot and stain a story. Visitors might have thought these villagers had forgotten about cleanliness, but the truth was the opposite. The crusty, smudged tunic was a last line of defense, not defeat. And in a world where everyone smelled strong, no one really noticed. Forget images of feather beds and quilts. Village families slept rough, maybe on plank frames covered with straw, hay, or even bunches of rushes. No memory foam, no delicate sheets, just a pile that creaked, scratched, and held the faint aroma of animals. Sometimes, families dispensed with a bed frame altogether, laying straw straight onto the dirt for a truly earthy sleep. Straw beds flattened, grew damp and inviting to insects, and sometimes even started to move on their own if they weren't refreshed often enough. Rushes brought into the house could provide a nice scent if mixed with herbs for about a day. Soon enough, they'd blend into the dirty floor along with food scraps and whatever else wandered inside. Fleas and lice loved the bedding as much as anyone, waking up scratching instead of sleeping. Well, that was just authentic. Uncomfortable as they were, these straw beds provided crucial insulation from the cold ground. Piling together atop them trapped warmth, creating pockets where freezing air couldn't reach. So, next time you melt into a comfy mattress, remember, a villager from long ago would have seen your struggle as pure luxury. In a home built from mud and hope, drafts weren't simple annoyances. They were nightly attacks. Villagers waged war on the cold, using whatever they could fit into every crack: moss, straw, scraps, even hair. If it was soft and might keep out the chill, it became part of the wall. Some especially determined souls added new layers of mud and dung to their houses before each winter, braving frozen hands and sharp smells for a little extra warmth. Roofs leaked, so folks patched holes with bundles of reeds, bits of old clothes, and, as a last resort, chunks of turf. Soon, every home looked like a patchy quilt assembled by someone who had run out of energy and supplies. If your home had a door or window, they were little more than wooden planks held together with a few nails and hope. Windows, when present, were usually stopped up with hide or thick cloth, sometimes treated with animal fat to block the wind and bring a new scent into the room. Each night was its own test. Just when you thought you'd blocked every draft, a sudden gust would find the spot you missed and chill you awake. Still, through dedication and grit, each family stuffed and patched their way through nature's worst. Sometimes the best solution for the cold was to accept that no one was sleeping in comfort. So villagers often took turns staying awake. Half the family watched the fire, poked at embers and patched gaps, while the other half tried to sleep, bundled under worn blankets and hay. Fire needed constant care, and reigniting it was never simple, so ember duty was shared, with everyone taking their turn. There were no late-night snacks, no alarms, just stiff limbs and grumbles, especially from those who snored through their shift. Children, as soon as they were able, helped out. Elders might sit by the fire a bit longer, both for wisdom and because getting up from a straw bed took real effort. Even when it was your turn to sleep, there was noise, People moving, animals rustling, the wind at the walls, and the occasional nudge from a restless sibling. Despite the hardship, the plan worked. There was always someone ready to keep the fire alive, and keeping the embers going meant the family lasted another night. So, the next time you're annoyed at adjusting the heat or letting out the dog in winter, remember the villager huddled by a waning fire at midnight, just hoping to keep their toes intact. The cold could even make you change how you breathed. Deep, open-mouthed breaths brought icy air straight to your lungs. A real danger in an age where even a cough could turn serious fast. So, villagers learned to breathe slow and shallow through their noses, gently warming the air on its way in. It wasn't perfect, but it kept the worst of the bitter air at bay. If you forgot and took a big gulp of air, you risked days of coughing, with only home remedies and prayers for comfort. Some people even pulled their scarves or shawls across their faces at night for extra protection, even if it meant waking up with a damp bit of fabric over their lips. Parents taught these breathing tricks early, scolding children for heavy panting in winter. Put together, layered wool, shallow breathing, and snuggling up with livestock, winter became a kind of harsh lesson plan. Surviving the night meant every breath was precious. One of the oldest secrets to keeping warm, though, was simply eating well. A full belly helped the body stay warm through hours of cold darkness. Heavy meals, thick stews full of turnips, onions, and grains, oat porridge, dense bread, were the best defense. On the best days, a hunk of salted meat or sausage might make its way to the pot. This wasn't comfort food in the decorative sense. It was a meal meant to sit in your belly all night, radiating slow, steady warmth. It wasn't just about eating a lot. Foods that took a long time to digest, especially those with fat, provided warmth throughout the night. Children ate heartily, since no one wanted to lie awake shivering. Late-night eating could bring on wild dreams, but it was worth it, a practical way to hold back the cold until sunrise. Without electric blankets or heaters, villagers grew inventive about warming up at bedtime. Enter the hay box and heated stone. The hay box was just a wooden crate packed with hay used to keep cooked food warm. But soon enough, villagers realized you could heat a rock in the fire, wrap it well, and place it under your bedding. A simple but effective way to draw out extra hours of warmth overnight. Carrying a hot stone was risky work. One wrong move and you could scorch your hands or invite disaster. But done right, those stones turned a cold bed into a small island of comfort. Not luxury, perhaps, but another piece of hope to make it through another chilly night. The hearth was everything. Whoever slept closest had the best chance of making it through the night unfrozen, so sleeping spots were chosen with care. The very old, little ones, and anyone ill were given the places of honor where the warmth was strongest. The rest spread out around them in layers, adding protection. But being close to the fire wasn't without its own dangers. Too near, and you might wake up singed. Too far, and you'd feel as though you were sleeping outside. The fire's warmth only traveled so far, so the family sometimes jostled for a position like sunbathers searching for the best patch of light on a chilly day. Animals, too, angled for warmth, sometimes squeezing between people and flames, or clucking softly in their sleep. Every flicker of the fire whispered that you'd survived this far, and with luck, you'd see morning. No one made it through winter by themselves, not if they hoped to last until spring. Survival meant looking out for one another, and that often meant the whole village. If a family's home went quiet or their hearth did not send smoke into the air, someone would check in. Sometimes this was out of friendship, sometimes because of a debt owed or a favor, yes, but mostly because the community's survival depended on every member. Villages had a kind of informal network, young people or elders who watched for trouble, noticing who hadn't come to barter at market, or whose home was silent on a frosty morning. If someone's fire went out, it was a near emergency. A neighbor would hurry over with embers or open their home for the night. It meant more crowding and more noise, but that was better than spring discovering empty beds and unanswered doors. Food stores, too, were sometimes shared. It wasn't charity, since nobody had much, but gathering the last of the season's food could pull everyone through the worst days. Even the youngest helped, carrying wood or sharing the precious warmth from one fire to another. Yes, even among neighbors there were disputes, over fences, livestock, or borrowed tools. But when the wind blew most sharply and each night threatened to last forever, old quarrels were set aside. After all, soon enough, you might be the one needing help. And so, through bitter months and countless cold nights, medieval villagers leaned on creativity, stubborn spirits, and the strength of their community side by side, one muddy step, one small fire, and one day nearer to spring. When the harsh grip of winter settled over medieval villages, ordinary folks did far more than add another cloak or poke at the hearth for warmth. They turned, time and again, to prayer, pouring out their hopes when the wind's cry outside their thin walls sounded more like a beast than a breeze, and the fire shrank to reddish ashes in the grate. During those long, shivering nights, faith became more than a ritual. It was as constant and vital as the air they breathed. Each night, before bundling themselves under rough blankets and beds of straw, families would kneel, murmuring quick prayers for warmth, for sturdy roofs, and for safety come dawn. To them, saints weren't abstract figures far off in the heavens. They were protectors at the gate. A saint like Blaise was a favorite in the cold months, called on to shield throats from aches that came with every breath of frigid air. And Nicholas, who centuries later would be crowned with holiday cheer, was once a name spoken with hope, a plea to keep misfortune away during the leanest times. Traditions and superstitions clung to them as tightly as their layers of wool. Some sprinkled holy water by the fire's edge before sleep, hoping to keep both misfortune and the midnight draughts at bay. Others drew blessed symbols above the door on sacred days, hoping these small acts would invite a bit of luck and warmth through the dark. Special candles, often given a blessing by the parish priest or the oldest, most devout woman in the village, might burn through the whole bitter night, a trembling light pushing back the deep cold that pressed against their frail homes. And whenever prayers rose up during these anxious hours, they came with promises. Dear Lord, if only we reach morning, I'll treat even the neighbor who takes our garden vegetables with more kindness. Religion in these times was heartfelt and constant, a daily plea for just enough to eat, a little heat, and the chance to survive another day until the earth thawed and green returned. Every whispered hope drifted among smoky rafters, woven into bedtime prayers and pressed beneath every itchy blanket. These slender threads of faith and stubbornness, more so than any clever trick or earthy skill, were what pulled them through the endless, punishing cold. But all that devotion and determination did not always bring safety. Sometimes, winter's strength proved overwhelming. It took not just a few people, but entire families, even entire villages, lost without a trace under drifts of snow and slabs of ice. The winter of the Great Famine in 1315 was especially merciless, when rain spoiled the harvests, animals wasted away, and the cold turned every day into a new struggle. People went hungry, sometimes eating whatever they could find, from old leather to tree bark, and in moments too terrible to imagine, sometimes even more desperate things. Failing to keep the fire alive in such times wasn't a small mistake. It could be fatal. Without its warmth, whole families might clasp together for the last time, lost to the cold. When thaw came, neighbors sometimes found houses where everyone inside had passed, arms still wrapped around one another's frozen forms, as if longing for a final bit of warmth. Homes themselves could buckle under the heavy snow or ice, roofs falling in with deadly consequences. Even seeking help, trudging from house to house through snow piled high, wasn't always an option. Sometimes everyone nearby was just as close to the edge. Illness favored these chill months, too. Hunger weakened the body, and the smoky air inside houses helped illness take hold. A cough in December could all too easily become a funeral by January. And there was frostbite, a cruel hazard of the cold. Fingers, toes, ears, all could blacken and die, leaving survivors marked forever by winter's touch, paying for life with the loss of some small part of themselves. In these villages, such scars were grim signs of strength, proof that someone had outlasted another winter, though not without cost. Most haunting of all, though, wasn't the death. It was how common it became. For these villagers, death in winter was just another neighbor, familiar, inevitable, always at the door. Each year, everyone understood that some among them would not make it to see the thaw. Still, despite everything, the bitter cold, the constant danger, these determined villagers pressed on. They mourned, they grieved, but above all, they fought to survive. So long as a single coal glowed in the hearth, or a single breath clouded the air, they found a reason to hope. When we look back now, it's easy to see only the hardship, the chapped hands, the frosty toes, poor little homes thick with smoke. But beneath all that, there was something more powerful. The resourcefulness, the grit, the unwavering ability to endure hardship. They had no heated homes, no modern comforts, not even the certainty of spring. What they did have was the spark of resilience. Every straw mattress, every patch of moss pushed into a wall, every bed of coals banked against the morning's chill, these spoke to creativity and persistence under pressure. They learned together, from each brutal winter and from one another. Their communities relied on shared effort, checking on the sick, pooling food when times grew lean, lending a hand knowing that tomorrow the roles could reverse. They lived by the rule that no one could outlast winter alone. Their lasting faith, too, was a form of endurance, woven not just from fear, but hope. Hope that the next day might be a little easier. Hope that, after countless dark nights, the sun would return and life would push up again through the soil. Because of their stubbornness, their support for each other, and their small victories, surviving just one more storm, making it through just one more frigid night, generations after them thrived. Slowly, they pushed civilization forward until heat, comfort, and plenty became an everyday fact, not a distant wish. Their struggles are stitched, unseen, into our lives now, present in every softly lit living room, every thick blanket, every calm winter night. So, the next time cold winds rattle the glass in your window, try to remember them. Those countless, resolute people who met winter's dread with nothing but hope, grit, and the gentle warmth of an ember, a breath, and one unyielding heart at a time. Anne Boleyn was not born into splendor or command. Around 1501, probably at a family estate in England, she arrived as the daughter of Thomas Boleyn, a skillful diplomat, and Elizabeth Howard, a woman with noble lineage and important ties. In the larger world of Tudor England, Anne's arrival didn't garner much notice. Yet, from such humble beginnings, a remarkable life quietly began, one that would ultimately reshape the course of her country's history. Her family quickly noticed something special in Anne. Not wealth or status, but intellect and a lively spirit. To nurture her promise, they sent her away to Europe. Her true schooling began in the court of Margaret of Austria in the Netherlands, a dazzling place, unreachable for most English girls. Here, Anne learned diplomacy, manners, and the tricky skills of political life. Though it was in France where Anne's gifts truly found their polish. She was welcomed into the refined courts of Queen Claude and Queen Marguerite of Navarre, absorbing lessons in charm, influence, foreign languages, and social grace. While other young women may have spent their days perfecting needlework, Anne devoted herself to learning the art of persuasion and careful conversation. So, when she returned to England in the early 1520s, Anne was altogether unique. She wasn't considered a classic beauty, but something about her, intelligent eyes, a clear, melodious voice, a purpose to her movements, captured attention. Anne didn't simply enter a room, she seemed to change its air entirely. In a world where women's futures were usually decided by marriage and birth, Anne refused to simply accept her fate. She had learned in foreign courts that confidence and intelligence could influence the powerful. She was still young, still unknown to history, but already change was gathering around her quietly, waiting for Anne to step into its path. When Anne returned to court in England, those around her quickly sensed she was not like the others. Amidst ladies-in-waiting who fit the mold, meek, pale, and gentle, Anne was something different, lively, unpredictable, impossible to look past. Serving as a maid of honor to Queen Catherine of Aragon, Anne nonetheless drew attention. She moved with elegance, spoke French as if born to it, and smiled with a confidence that made her stand out. Men took notice, women whispered, and soon the entire court was aware of the striking Boleyn girl. It didn't take long for her to draw the gaze of King Henry, a man who rarely lacked for admirers. But while his court was accustomed to quiet flirtations and secret affairs, Anne stood apart. She answered his compliments playfully, but held her distance. She resisted his advances, even as Henry became increasingly determined to win her. His growing obsession became the talk of the court. Love letters flew between them, full of longing and frustration. Henry eventually offered Anne the unofficial but powerful place of royal mistress. Astonishing everyone, Anne refused. She wouldn't become another forgotten name. If Henry truly wanted her, she told him, he'd have to make her queen. A daring demand almost no one believed possible, as Henry was already married, and dissolving his union with Catherine would take nothing less than a break with the church itself. Anne, however, never wavered. Her travels had taught her what subtle power queens could wield. She knew the risks, but she was determined to change her fate, and England's, with her own hands. The passionate connection between Anne and Henry soon erupted beyond personal drama and became a matter for the entire nation. Henry grew fixated, convinced that only Anne could give him the fresh start and the son he longed for. Yet Queen Catherine had been his wife for nearly 20 years, beloved by many and fiercely protected by her relatives abroad. Divorce was nearly unthinkable, but Henry pressed on, arguing, despite an older papal blessing, that his marriage to Catherine was cursed and could only bring misfortune. Anne knew to hold her ground, never appearing too eager, and never stepping too far forward. Each gesture, each word was carefully chosen. She wasn't just trying to marry a king, she was quietly laying claim to a crown itself. The English court quickly divided. Some families jostled to gain Anne's favor, sensing where things might lead. Others clung to Catherine, distressed at the turbulence Anne's rise brought. Letters crossed the sea, alliances shifted, and the air filled with tense rumors and fear. As time slipped on, Henry's frustration swelled. He wrote to Rome, pushed his advisors, and slowly realized the church would not help him. Catherine's family stood strong, none more so than her nephew, the most powerful ruler in Europe. Still, Henry dug in, convinced his future lay with Anne. What had begun as a royal romance now threatened to overturn not just relationships, but traditions, faith, and the very fabric of English society. Anne was not only reshaping her own life, she was pushing an entire nation toward transformation, with no certain path back. After nearly 7 years of waiting, intrigue, and upheaval, Anne's gamble finally succeeded. In early 1533, she married Henry in secret, though Catherine was still, in the eyes of church and state, his lawful wife. Within months, Anne was crowned Queen of England in a glittering ceremony at Westminster Abbey, a momentous occasion but not an entirely loyal one. Some in the crowd cheered, others looked on with worry, clinging to Catherine's memory. Whispers rose. Some doubted whether a queen with such bold manner and foreign airs would bring fortune or ruin. Anne ascended to the throne not as a cherished figure, but as a storm. Unlike Catherine, who was known for humility and devotion, Anne was bold, clever, and far more direct. She wore bright colors, spoke her mind, and gathered both admirers and enemies in quick succession. Her entire future hinged on what happened next. She needed to give Henry a son. When her first child, Elizabeth, was born in late 1533, Anne hid her own disappointment and soldiered on, certain a son would follow. Henry, however, revealed his doubt more and more. Despite this, Anne's influence grew for a while. She brought her relatives to prominence, welcomed ambassadors, and transformed court life in her image. Henry, eager to support her, broke away from Rome and established the Church of England, placing himself at its head, ensuring Anne's crown was untouchable. Yet, even in these victories, danger lurked. Friends drifted away, rivals watched for an opening, and Henry's attention began to stray. Anne had reached a nearly impossible height, but now she would have to fight with everything she had to stay there. From nearly the moment Anne placed the crown onto her head, new troubles emerged. The greatest pressure was the quest for a boy. Elizabeth's birth was joyful, but not the answer Henry or Anne longed for. Anne suffered several more pregnancies, each ending in heartbreak and leaving her more worn in body and spirit. With every loss, the ground beneath her grew thinner, and Henry's affection slowly chilled. Anne, never one to be silenced or pushed aside, argued her case, stood firm, and tried to hold her ground with Henry. But the very strength that once attracted the king now began to annoy him. Outside their private chambers, enemies circled. Nobles who tolerated Anne out of necessity found chances to undermine her, while Catherine's supporters barely hid their bitterness. Rumors about Anne spread. She was blamed for religious changes and even accused of dark ambitions. Then came Jane Seymour, calm, modest, and everything Henry now seemed to want. Anne saw it happening and did her best. Gifts, promises, pleas for patience. But Henry's heart was drifting, and the political winds were shifting against her. Thomas Cromwell, once her friend and partner in reform, saw the change. He began collecting evidence, rumors, and accusations, building a case that Anne could be brought down. The woman who outmaneuvered all rivals now found herself losing ground quickly. Anne's rise had taken extraordinary courage and intelligence, but in Henry's court, only new success mattered, and it was clear her enemies were turning the gears that would seal her fate. Anne's fall did not arrive by battle or rebellion, but through shadowy plans and whispered betrayals. Cromwell, seeking to please Henry and remove Anne with the least difficulty, orchestrated her destruction. Henry was searching for a way out, but wanted Anne's departure to seem just. A simple divorce would wound his pride. Cromwell brought accusations no one had expected: adultery, incest, plots against the throne. Anne, once celebrated for her wit and grace, was painted as treacherous and dangerous. Confessions were forced, facts twisted, simple gestures transformed into crimes. Several men, including Anne's own brother, were swept into the storm with her. The charges were riddled with inconsistencies, but it didn't matter. The truth in Henry's court was whatever suited the king's needs. Anne, realizing the threat, defended herself with all her strength, reminding Henry and the court of her loyalty, her sacrifices, her love. But the man who had once risked everything for her could barely meet her eyes. In May of 1536, Anne was sent to the Tower, not as a queen, but as a prisoner. As the heavy gate closed behind her, she faced not just loss, but the end of a dream she had so nearly realized. Anne stood before her peers, many of whom owed their positions to her rise, as they sat in judgment, ready to wipe her from history. The list of accusations was shocking: betrayal, forbidden love, conspiracy. In a different world, such charges against a queen would seem impossible. Here, they served their purpose, giving Henry the justification he needed. She answered with the same strength that had made her so remarkable. Anne denied every charge calmly, clearly, and without faltering. She reminded them she had been anointed, chosen by God, steadfast in loyalty. Her defense, moving, courageous, fell on deaf ears. The outcome was fixed before the first word. Witness after witness spoke, some bribed, some frightened, their stories weaving a patchwork of half-truths and guesses. In the end, substance did not matter. Anne was found guilty. So too were her brother and the others accused with her. Death by beheading was her sentence, considered merciful compared to what might have been. Anne did not break. Standing tall, pale but unbroken, she made her peace with those final minutes, praying for forgiveness and mercy as the doors swung shut, leaving the court with both relief and unease. By bringing her down, they did not erase Anne Boleyn. They made her timeless in sorrow and in legend. Returned to the Tower to wait for the end, Anne kept her composure. She spent her last hours in prayer, kneeling on cold stones, her hands steady, her voice unwavering. She confessed to no wrongdoing, sure in her heart of her innocence. She said she was not afraid to die, but hoped her death might bring quiet to her country and compassion for her young daughter, Elizabeth. Her attendants, the few loyal friends left, wept. Anne comforted them, even finding dark humor in her fate, suggesting she'd be remembered as the queen who'd lost not just her crown, but her very head. This spark, her stubborn, wry spirit, remained with her to the last. Henry, for his part, showed no sign of forgiveness. Before Anne's fate was even sealed, he was making way for his next marriage, eager to move on. For Anne, this truth, her lover and king turning away so quickly, may have been her deepest pain. On the evening before her death, Anne learned she would die the following morning. She did not sleep much, choosing instead to pray, asking God for mercy for all, perhaps even for herself, for the ambition that had helped bring her here. Henry, showing a touch of royal care, ordered a French swordsman to carry out her sentence, a faster, more dignified end than the traditional axe. A small kindness, intended more for his conscience than for Anne. At dawn, she dressed with care, a somber gown with fur trim, a red petticoat, a show of dignity and grace for her final moment. She pinned up her hair and covered it with a plain cap, prepared to face the end with courage. As the morning mist clung to the stones of the tower, Anne, queen, mother, and survivor, walked to her final trial. She shed no tears, made no pleas. She met her last hour with a quiet strength that would echo far beyond her lifetime. On May 19, 1536, Anne climbed the scaffold within the tower's shadow. A modest crowd gathered, guards, onlookers, a few witnesses, held in a hush as if the very air trembled. She seemed thinner, paler, yet unafraid. There was no wild panic, no breakdown, only a calm dignity that matched the greatness of her story. She spoke only briefly. No accusations, no excuses. She prayed for Henry's health, even as he had abandoned her. Her last words were those of grace, asking forgiveness, not revenge. The crowd was moved, even those who'd come to see her fall. The swordsman, brought from France to ensure a swift end, stepped forward. Anne knelt, eyes heavenward, hands together, a white cloth placed over her eyes. The sword flashed once. Quiet, quick, final. Anne Boleyn, who had changed a nation, was gone. She was buried quietly in the Tower grounds, no grand grave, no formal farewell. Laid to rest in a narrow box because preparations were hurried. Once crowned in gold, now resting in simple darkness. Yet Anne's story did not end in that lonely grave. Her daughter, Elizabeth, the child whose birth had disappointed a king, would one day rise to rule with strength and brilliance unmatched, guiding England into an age of prosperity, culture, and power. Through Elizabeth, Anne's legacy grew brighter than any jewel or title she had ever worn. She shaped her nation not by living on, but through the changes and courage she inspired. By the early 1770s, the American colonies simmered with growing frustration, a pot nearly boiling over. Once, Britain was looked to as a proud parent, but by now resentments had curdled into deep suspicion and anger. The trouble didn't begin with tea. Earlier laws, like the Stamp Act, had infuriated the colonists by taxing everything from newspapers to playing cards. The Townshend Acts followed, adding taxes on essentials like paper and glass. Every new act, conceived in Britain's Parliament, far from colonial voices, felt not like shared governance, but an insult. To begin with, resistance was formal and polite. Colonial assemblies wrote up objections, merchants banded together to refuse British goods, and writers such as Samuel Adams and John Dickinson filled the papers with arguments for freedom and rights. But over time, disappointment hardened into anger. It became clear that those in power across the ocean were not listening, perhaps did not even care. Many colonists kept hoping that if they complained loud enough, the taxes would be withdrawn. Sometimes it worked. The Stamp Act was repealed after much protest. But every victory seemed only to bring fresh burdens, reminders that colonial voices went unheard. It was never really about the taxes, which were modest. It was the principle, being taxed without consent, treated as subjects with no voice, ruled from afar. No city reflected these feelings as strongly as Boston. There, a defiant group known as the Sons of Liberty made their presence felt, growing bolder as tensions mounted. In 1770, when British soldiers opened fire on unarmed townspeople, a moment remembered as the Boston Massacre, mistrust and blood mixed on the city's stones. By 1773, resistance throughout the colonies neared a breaking point. The final spark, the one that would finally tip protest into decisive action, came in the unlikely shape of tea. That December night, when crates of tea floated in Boston's icy harbor, the world quietly shifted forever. In 1773, Parliament misread colonial feelings catastrophically. Believing the Americans would welcome cheaper tea, lawmakers passed the Tea Act to support the troubled East India Company and to quietly reaffirm power over the colonies. On paper, it seemed a bargain. The company could send tea straight to the colonies, skipping usual costs, meaning a good cup of tea would cost less at the counter. But the problem was never the price. The Tea Act kept a much-hated tax in place. Accepting this bargain would mean accepting Parliament's right to tax Americans without their approval, a step most colonists refused. Word spread quickly. Colonial merchants bristled at the idea of a monopoly that threatened their trade. Patriots burned with the knowledge that Parliament still did not recognize their rights. In Boston, memories of earlier injustices were still raw. Many saw the Tea Act as a trick, a test of colonial resolve. Refusing to touch the tea became a badge of honor, a statement of loyalty to colonial rights. Crowds gathered for meetings, newspapers rang with angry arguments, and groups like the Sons of Liberty, inspired by Samuel Adams and others, led calls for a complete boycott. In ports up and down the coast, ships carrying tea were turned away. The message was clear: we will not be fooled. But in Boston, things played out differently. 3 ships, the Dartmouth, Eleanor, and Beaver, arrived and sat in harbor, unable to leave, unable to unload. Royal officials insisted the tea be taken ashore. Colonists stood fast in refusal. For days, tension wound tighter and tighter, every clock tick a reminder something would soon break. With tea ships stranded in Boston's harbor, the city turned into a pressure cooker. Each passing day drew lines tighter. Everywhere, in public halls, in churches, in bustling taverns, people debated how to respond. The Sons of Liberty, with leaders like Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and Paul Revere, kept the resistance focused, posting notices and rallying citizens. Their meetings grew, from dozens to thousands. The Old South Meeting House became the center of this movement, filled with townspeople and neighbors from the country, voices rising together in unity and protest. Inside, resolutions were debated, speeches rang out, and tempers flared. Every vote to keep the tea off British soil was another blow against distant rule. But the law was clear. After 20 days in port, if the tea was not unloaded and the tax paid, officials could seize the cargo and British forces could step in. The Sons of Liberty understood that even one slip, even one crate accepted, would be a surrender of principle. This was no longer just a matter of trade. It was about recognition and rights. The colonial governor, Thomas Hutchinson, stood his ground, refusing to let the ships depart without the tea being offloaded. For him, giving way meant chaos defeating law. Boston's standoff became the single focus of attention. Everyone sensed history bearing down. All it would take was one act to set events into motion. December 16th, 1773, dawned gray and sharp over Boston. The 3 tea ships remained, ticking clocks anchored in the icy harbor. The legal deadline had come. The tea must be taken ashore, the tax paid, or Britain would seize the shipments by force. Everyone knew what was at stake. If the tea made it onto dry land, the colonists' claims to rights would lose their power. That morning, thousands packed into the Old South Meeting House, braving muddy roads and bitter cold to hear what would be decided. With the room overflowing, many pressed together outside, listening for scraps of a fiery speech. Samuel Adams, steady at the head of the meeting, guided the discussions as speaker after speaker denounced not just the Tea Act, but every sign of distant tyranny. Still, uncertainty hung over the crowd. Was there any way forward that would avoid outright war? Any peaceful way to stop the tea before it crossed into colonial hands? Late in the day, riders arrived with grim news. The governor remained unmoved. The ships would not be allowed to leave, and the king's orders would be enforced. The tea would be seized. The law would triumph. Samuel Adams rose once more and spoke the words that closed the debate. "This meeting can do nothing more to save the country." With that, he signaled what all understood. Words had run their course. Only action remained. A moment later, a war whoop echoed through the fading light. It was the sign. Men drew blankets about their shoulders, blackened their faces with soot, added feathers as a symbol. They weren't truly pretending to be Mohawk warriors, but rather choosing a new identity, one that spoke to their readiness to defy the old order. The day's deadline had passed. Boston would not answer with hesitation, but with determined resistance. As darkness settled over Boston that night, silent figures filtered through empty streets. Ordinary men in rough disguise, soot on their faces, feathers tucked in. They weren't fooling anyone. Their intent was clear. By the dozens, they hurried toward Griffin's Wharf, where the 3 ships waited quietly in the cold. The harbor water was black and chilling, the air crisp and sharp. There was no riot, no reckless shouts. Purpose and discipline ruled the night. With axes and clubs in hand, the disguised men swiftly boarded the ships. The few sailors aboard were left unharmed. They were moved aside, standing quietly as the event unfolded. With swift, practiced swings, men broke open heavy wooden chests, the scent of fresh tea drifting out into the cool darkness. Others lifted the crates and tossed them into the harbor, each crash resonating over the calm water. One after another, a total of 342 chests were shattered and thrown overboard until the surface churned with thousands of pounds of loose tea. People watched from the wharf, silent and unsure. Nearby British guards stood by, not stepping in. Why they did nothing is still uncertain. Perhaps they were confused, sympathetic, or worried about what could happen next. Some stories say even those loyal to Britain sensed that something fundamental had changed, and there would be no stopping it that night. The self-control displayed was remarkable. No cargo besides the tea was taken. No one searched the ships for valuables. Only the tea, seen as the symbol of British dominance, was targeted. Even though many in Boston faced hunger and hardship every day, the protest did not become an excuse to steal. It didn't. By the time dawn neared, the harbor looked transformed. Broken chests and soaked tea swirling in the water. The salty sea air mixed with the strong, bitter smell of crushed tea, giving the night a new, almost sweet scent. Quietly, the men slipped away, disappearing into Boston's back streets and alleys. No names left behind, no leaders stepping forward, just the undeniable sign of a rebellion. As the last pieces floated in the harbor, Boston was left nearly breathless. The Boston Tea Party was not a wild, chaotic affair. It wasn't a fight or a drunken outburst. This was something much more rare, a careful, purposeful act of resistance carried out in the shadows. That night, the harbor became a huge teapot, dark with East India Company tea. Some locals, inspired and curious, tried to collect the soaked leaves, but members of the organizing group gently stopped them. Nothing was to be saved. No one would benefit personally from what happened. This was an act of principle, pure and direct. When the sun came up, the air was heavy with the smell of tea and salt. The news spread quickly, by word of mouth, letter, and newspaper. Within hours, everyone from young apprentices to established merchants knew what had taken place. People's reactions split sharply. Among those seeking change, there was an overwhelming pride. Common people had challenged the strongest empire on earth. But others felt only fear and shock, seeing the destruction as rash, perhaps a mistake that might never be undone. Governor Thomas Hutchinson seethed in frustration, furious at both the loss and the message it carried. If the king's rule could be broken so openly in Boston, what might happen next? British leaders were astounded. They had been prepared for protests, for refusals to buy British goods, or perhaps another violent crowd. Nothing like this. No confusion, no looting, just organized destruction of royal property, with not a single window broken. Captains of the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver could do nothing but watch as their valuable cargo disappeared. In official records, the damage would be counted at over £10,000, a huge sum. But what really vanished that night was trust, loyalty, and the idea that Britain's control depended on the agreement of the colonies. As the tea sank, a different truth began to rise. The time for peaceful complaints was over, and a reckoning was coming. Boston was ready. When news of the event reached London, officials responded in outrage. To them, this was far more than protest. It was open rebellion and a clear challenge to royal power. Upon hearing, King George III was filled with cold, quiet fury. The British Parliament, already upset by years of colonial resistance, demanded punishment, not just for Boston, but as a warning to all the colonies. In response, Parliament passed laws so harsh that Americans soon called them the Intolerable Acts. The impact was immediate. The Boston Port Act closed the busy harbor, the lifeblood of the city, until the tea's cost was repaid and control restored. Ships could neither come nor go. Trade stopped, supplies ran low, and the once busy waterfront became strangely quiet. More laws followed. The Massachusetts Government Act took away the colony's right to self-rule, placing it under direct control of royal officials. The Administration of Justice Act allowed British officials accused of crimes to be tried back in England, a sign that they were out of reach of local laws. To enforce their will, British soldiers were housed among Boston's people, a daily reminder that any uprising would be met with force. The message was clear. Defiance would be crushed. Freedom was not to be tolerated. But rather than bring fear, these measures created anger and unity. The suffering of Boston, its closed port, its struggling citizens, moved people throughout the colonies. Wagons filled with food and supplies came from nearby towns. Letters arrived from other colonies showing support and pledging solidarity. Quiet meetings, open talks, and a swelling sense of togetherness began to gather previously divided colonies into one. What had started as Boston's fight now belonged to all of America. Britain meant to punish one city, but instead made it a symbol and a rallying point for resistance. Where the call for change had been faint and divided, it now swept from town to town, refusing to be silenced. The punishment of Boston triggered a reaction across all 13 colonies. Resentment grew into a powerful unity. For years, these colonies had acted more like distant relatives than a family, competing, arguing, separated by miles, religion, and trade. But when Parliament closed Boston's port and took away self-rule, it became clear. What happened in Massachusetts could happen anywhere. From Virginia to Pennsylvania, from South Carolina to New Hampshire, help and sympathy came. Colonists sent food, supplies, and heartfelt letters to Boston. Community halls filled with angry voices. Newspapers rushed to share the latest events. Boston's struggle had become everyone's cause. So, in September of 1774, something new happened. The First Continental Congress gathered in Philadelphia. Representatives from 12 colonies met to plan a united response. Figures like George Washington, Patrick Henry, John Adams, and Samuel Adams, once mostly known in their own regions, now stood together, guiding a growing movement. Their aim was not yet independence. Most hoped for peace, for a return to respectful partnership with Britain. But underneath their careful speeches and polite letters, new ideas were growing. They realized the colonies could not stand alone anymore. Congress agreed to stop buying British goods, promised to support each other, and made it plain. An attack on one would be seen as an attack on all. In public houses and private homes, people began using words once whispered: unity, resistance, freedom. Britain had hoped to crush rebellion. Instead, it had brought the colonies together. Now, despite all their differences, colonists were beginning to think of themselves as Americans. The winds of revolution were no longer just faint breezes. They had gathered into a storm, and it was now beyond Britain's control. That night when the tea was thrown into Boston Harbor, it wasn't only chests that were lost. The hope that the colonies would forever remain loyal also drowned in those waters. The Boston Tea Party sparked a change that no king, no army, and no distant parliament could extinguish. In the weeks and months after, small acts of protest gave way to organized resistance. Local militias gathered, weapons and supplies were quietly assembled, and men who once toasted King George in the taverns now spoke in hushed voices about freedom. Boston became a symbol, enduring hardship, but never defeated. The harder Britain tried to maintain control, the more America slipped from its grasp. Each ship passing Boston's closed, empty piers was a reminder that tyranny faced something immovable in people's determination. When the intolerable acts passed, the intent was to scare others into obedience. Instead, Boston became a martyr city, a cry that echoed from Georgia to New Hampshire. Their futures were bound together. The fight was no longer about tea. It was about survival, about identity, about freedom itself. By early 1775, everything was poised on the edge. Outside Boston, in towns like Lexington and Concord, British soldiers marched to seize colonial arms, only to meet farmers ready to defend their rights. The first gunshots of the American Revolution were fired, directly linked to that night when people chose what was right over what was profitable and sent a fortune's worth of tea into the harbor. The Boston Tea Party showed that revolutions don't always begin with grand announcements. Sometimes they start in the quiet, with a small group faced with fear, choosing courage instead. Throwing the tea was a rejection, not just of a tax, but of an entire system, of an empire's claim. The path ahead would bring struggle and pain, but by then something had become clear. That night in Boston, the American people became revolutionaries. Their journey was just beginning. Long before the pyramids of Giza dominated the horizon, before cities rose in Mesopotamia or stones were lifted at Stonehenge, another incredible city quietly grew. Hidden among the dry coastal valleys of Peru, Caral began almost 5,000 years ago, then gradually faded away as the centuries passed, buried by wind and dust and nearly forgotten. For generations, no one knew it was ever there. The Soup Valley, where Caral once thrived, seems at first a most unlikely place for civilization. Its land is arid, with a river so thin it barely sparkles among rocks and sand. To most, it appeared empty and unforgiving, a place few would expect to find life, much less a city. Yet it was here, in this harsh landscape, that people built one of humanity's earliest cities. Not just a jumble of dwellings, but a thoughtfully organized community covering over 150 acres. Pyramids, open plazas, homes, and spaces for rituals filled its grounds. This was an organized, purposeful society, rising hundreds of years before the first Egyptian monuments. The people of Caral did all this without wheels, without writing, without metal tools. Huge structures built with simple things: stone, earth, plant fiber, and extraordinary determination. For thousands of years, Caral's ruins slept beneath the soil, passed by travelers who mistook the odd shapes for natural hills, never imagining what was hidden below. Only in the late 20th century did archaeologist Ruth Shady and her team begin to uncover Caral. Their discoveries changed what we thought we knew about the Americas, prompting the world to rethink the beginnings of civilization. Caral's rise, quiet glory, and fall were all but erased from memory, until now, as its stones speak again, telling of a wise, peaceful people who created something beautiful in a place where survival once seemed impossible. And their story was only getting started. When you first see the Soup Valley, it's easy to think little could survive there. The winds are harsh, the ground is dry, and sunlight beats down, turning the earth into brittle, cracked sheets. Water is rare, the river a fragile blue ribbon. It looks lifeless, a place abandoned by hope. But those who founded Caral saw possibilities, not challenges. They looked at the river, however modest, and saw a spark of potential. With patience, skill, and faith, they turned the harsh land into an oasis filled with life. Their first success was learning to farm. They tamed the river's occasional floods, crafting clever irrigation ditches to draw water across the valley. Where others saw nothing but dust, they made green emerge: cotton, beans, squash, guava, sweet potatoes. Cotton was their wealth, spun into nets for fishing, woven into cloth, and traded far and wide. This linked them to coastal villages and distant peoples, stretching connections beyond their dry home. Yet growing food was only one part of their success. The community knew survival rested on living in balance with nature. Their buildings were made to endure both the sun's heat and rare heavy storms. They watched the stars and seasons, planning their crops with what seems almost scientific care. Trade ran through their society, connecting them to the wider world: fish, fruit, handmade goods reaching up and down the coast in exchange for shells, stones, ideas. In a place others called barren, Corral thrived through smart choices, creative thinking, and tight community bonds. They didn't dominate the desert. They learned from it, working with its challenges instead of simply fighting them. It was here that Corral turned from an unlikely settlement into a center of culture and achievement, its rise just beginning. Standing above the landscape like ancient sentinels, the pyramids of Corral challenge everything we thought about early American civilizations. These are not simple piles, but large, purpose-built structures, showing sophisticated knowledge and careful design. The city's main pyramid, called the Pyramide Mayor, was more than 450 feet long and stood almost 60 feet tall, a true wonder beside other ancient achievements. Built from stone, layered with mud and bags woven from reeds filled with rocks, it was made to last, not only through the passing years, but through the ground-shaking earthquakes that still strike this region. And last it did, almost 5,000 years, still rising above the desert floor. Corral's pyramids were unlike the tombs of Egypt. They were not built for burial. Instead, they stood at the heart of public life, places for ceremony, community, and leadership. Plazas, both sunken and round, spread out at their feet, spaces designed for festivals, meetings, and shared belief. The city's shape itself suggests a people who valued unity and order. Smaller residential areas surrounded the ceremonial core, homes for priests, artisans, farmers, and leaders. The buildings themselves were planned to connect with important times in the sky: sunrises, solstices, and the dance of the stars. For the people of Corral, building was not just practical, it was spiritual, mathematical, cosmic. Wandering these ruins today, it's impossible not to feel wonder. No iron tools, no wheels, no beasts of burden, yet stone monuments rose with geometric grace. The Great Pyramids at Corral were built not for power or war, but to join earth and sky, to unite people with each other, and with the mysteries above. Their silent stones still share their story, refusing to be forgotten. But among these ruins is something rare. Almost no weapons have ever been discovered. No defensive walls guard the city. No signs of brutality lie beneath the sands. While many other early societies grew through battle, Corral was built upon peace. The absence of warriors, of battle scars, of mass graves tells a different kind of story. Here was a city that grew through sharing, not conquest. Resources were poured into architecture, music, and community, not armies. The grand plazas and pyramids were places of gathering, ritual, and governance, instruments of harmony instead of domination. Trade fueled Corral's success. Cotton from the riverbanks became fishing nets, essential for life along the coast. In return, Corral received fish and treasures from afar: bright shells, precious stones, rare fruits, tying faraway neighbors to their city with strong threads of exchange. Religion and public ceremony formed the heart of social life. The city's large plazas likely echoed with music and chanting. Rituals and festivals brought everyone together, uniting people through shared faith. Leadership appears to have come from organization and spiritual strength, rather than military power, as grand construction projects and vast farming required skillful cooperation. In a world often shaped by conflict, Corral shines as proof that peace can be a foundation for greatness. Through trust, creativity, and collaboration, This city achieved what others had through war, enduring achievement without the scars of violence. Music and ritual colored life in Caral, woven into every part of existence. Archaeologists have found delicate flutes of bone, whistles made from antler, and small drums stretched with animal hide. Each one crafted with skill and tuned to create specific notes, built to carry songs across the plazas. In a society without writing, music became the voice of the people. Imagine the heartbeat of drums at dusk, flutes sighing like the desert wind, the stamping of feet as evening turned to night. Fires burning atop pyramid platforms, ritual leaders in fine cloths chanting to their gods of the river, the earth, the night sky. At these moments, the city itself became a symphony. The very design of Caral, the sunken, round plazas, the pyramids, not as tombs, but as sacred links to the heavens, shows this was a community built for ceremony and togetherness. Their gatherings likely marked seasons, planting and harvest, stars moving through the sky. Music was not simply for pleasure, but a way to connect, people with each other, and all of them with the universe and the unknown. Unlike some ancient cultures, Caral left no lasting images of war or bloodshed. The spiritual world here seems gentle, focused on harmony and joy. Even now, the wind passing through broken stones sometimes carries a hint of those lost melodies, the music of a people who found beauty and unity in a landscape others called emptiness. If Caral was a center for trade and gatherings, it was also an engineering marvel, a triumph of human skill in a demanding environment. Without iron, without wheels or horses, these people shaped a lasting city from stone and earth. Their accomplishments are truly remarkable. Massive pyramids were built not from tiny bricks, but from large stones. Some moved in baskets made of reeds, strong and flexible. Layer upon layer, stone and earth were arranged to create solid structures able to last for ages. Caral lay in an area often shaken by earthquakes. Yet their buildings stayed upright, suffering little compared to others. How did they do it? By smart design, using flexible layers, wide bases, and smooth rounded corners that absorbed shocks from the earth. This knowledge was not learned from books, but from years of careful observation. Water management was another quiet achievement. The people built complex channels, carrying river water to their fields, a feat that let crops grow even during dry months. Not a drop wasted. Every bit was precious. Even the city's shape reflected a deep understanding of the sun's movement and the stars' paths across the sky. Some plazas seem to have helped priests and planners track these cosmic rhythms, helping with planting and harvest. Caral was laid out in a way that balanced communal areas, government, homes, and sacred places. Everything arranged for both daily life and for connection to the eternal. Their buildings were not only for now, but for future generations. Today, even engineers are amazed by how Caral has stood the test of time. True wisdom, they realized, often comes from working with nature, not against it. For centuries, Caral flourished. Its music, trade, and carefully built stone monuments shone amidst the vast desert. Then, with hardly a sign, it faded. There was no war, no fire, no mass graves. The city slowly emptied. Plazas were left silent. Pyramids became places for winds and drifting sand. The music and laughter slipped quietly away. Why did they leave? That question lingers even now. Some believe that the climate changed. A long, dry spell may have destroyed the farms, leaving fields brown and empty. With little surplus to trade, the economy may have unraveled. Others think trade routes changed. As new cultures grew stronger and centers of power shifted, Caral's region may have lost its main role. Cotton, fish, and food that were once in demand might no longer have been enough, draining its lifeblood. Still others suggest inner troubles, though without writing we cannot know for sure. Political or religious changes, perhaps. In many societies, even peace cannot last forever when survival is threatened. But the end of Crackle was not sudden. Families likely moved away little by little, hoping for better chances elsewhere. The stories of the city faded into legend. The winds covered the stone, burying temples and musical pipes beneath the sand. A busy, bright world became a field of silent, sleeping mounds. For almost 4,000 years, Crackle lay hidden, a gentle ghost beneath the valley. Only recently have researchers begun to gently brush away the sand and rediscover its past. Why did such an advanced and beautiful city simply vanish? Perhaps even the greatest achievements remain fragile, always at risk from forces beyond our control, changing weather, shifting fortunes, and the silent march of time. For so long, the hills above Crackle watched as travelers and herders passed by, unaware of what lay beneath their feet, the remains of a world older even than Egypt's wonders. To them, these were just hills, shaped by wind and time. Only in the last years of the 20th century did Crackle's true story begin to surface. In the 1990s, Ruth Shady and her team entered the Soup Valley, driven by curiosity and the sense that the hills might have secrets to share. What they found would change our understanding. Careful work revealed walls and platforms, stairways and plazas, a city old beyond belief. Radiocarbon dating showed Crackle was over 4,600 years old, thriving alongside the very first complex cultures of the Old World. This discovery rewrote history books. Before then, most experts thought civilization in the Americas arrived much later, always lagging behind older empires. Now, the truth was different. The Americas had their own early centers of greatness, building on their own terms. Among the ruins, they found more than stone. There were musical instruments, fishing nets, woven cloth, ancient, knotted records, offerings made to the gods. Each find spoke of intelligence, creativity, and caring effort. Rediscovering Crackle was more than a scientific breakthrough. It was like awakening a world that had slept in the sand for ages. Its plazas felt the sun and wind again, and its quiet story became known once more. Today, Crackle is cherished as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a link not only to Peru's past, but to the earliest dreams of all humanity. The stones had waited, holding their secrets, until someone came to listen and learn again. Among Crackle's pyramids and plazas, history whispers. These old stones change the way we see our shared journey. It is not just a story of conquest or bloodshed, but of hope, invention, and connection. Before Greece or Rome, before even Egypt's pharaohs, the people of Crackle were building a remarkable world. They built pyramids with no wheels, mapped the sky without writing, and traded goods and ideas across a harsh land, all without the marks of violence. In a time often marked by wars and empires, Crackle offers another possibility. Civilization built on communion, on learning, on dreaming together. Greatness, it reminds us, comes not from the number of armies, but from people choosing to build, to celebrate, to reach for understanding. Crackle's message echoes far past its desert home. It reminds us that civilization's story has many origins. The desire to create, to belong, to wonder. These live within all of us, no matter where we dwell. Walking today among Crackle's stones, you may still sense the throb of old drums, the gentle call of flutes, the cheerful sounds of busy plazas and children playing under the vast night sky. Their stories live on, etched into the heart of the earth. Carol teaches us that the spirit of a place, and of its people, can sleep beneath the sand, waiting to inspire us again. In the great flow of human history, Carol remains not only a tale from our past, but a guiding light for the future, a testament that even in the hardest places, the seeds of greatness can take root and reach for the stars.